I was introduced to Zalman Newfield's book by my friend Clara and read it over the Australian summer. For me, it caused deep reflection upon my own life, especially since the first 36 years of my life had been spent in sectarian Catholicism and then in a high demand group here in Australia. The questions that Zalman posed throughout the book and the list of questions in the appendix that he used for his own interviewees caused me to ponder deeply upon my own life and how much impact strict Catholicism had had on my life, my identity, my habits, my thoughts. And I haven't been able to answer all the questions, but they have really caused me to think deeply about my past. I have recommended this book to many others. 2 of my friends have bought this book, and by their words, and here in Australia, this is definitely high praise indeed. They described it as being bloody brilliant, and it has caused them too to deeply reflect upon their religious past and answer questions to help them move on with their life. I hope that you enjoy this conversation that I had with Zalman Newfield, and I look forward to having him on the podcast again. Zalman Newfield is an assistant professor of sociology at Borough of Manhattan Community College and the author of Degrees of Separation, Identity Formation While Leaving Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, Temple University Press 2020. Newfield is also a host on the Jewish Studies channel of the New Books Network podcast. Visit him online at zalmannewfield.com.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm thrilled that you I'm thrilled that you wrote this book, and also I was very excited that you wrote back and you were keen to have an interview, because I found that this book really struck a chord with me, because having been through a similar experience, obviously not in Judaism, but in strict sectarian Catholicism, it really struck a chord for me, because it really just explained the difference that I felt. Because I know that when I left I'll call it a doomsday cult, even though it's not exactly the right term, but when I did leave, like, there was no one else that I knew that was like myself. And I felt weird, I felt odd, I didn't fit in, I wanted to desperately to fit in, and I just, and having 8 children looking to me for their stability and security, like, I just knew that I had to somehow be normal. But what was that? Like, what's normal?
Yes, that's great. What is normal, right?
So I would like to ask you, like, when you were interviewing your interviewees for Degrees of Separation, did they ever express to you this, feeling weird and what is normal?
I think probably every single person I interviewed. So I interviewed 74 people for my dissertation. I was a PhD student in sociology at the time in the New York University program. And then my dissertation ultimately was published as a book under the title Degrees of Separation, Identity Formation While Leaving Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and was published in 2020 by Temple University Press. And I think every single person I spoke to, maybe if there was any one thing that everyone was kind of obsessed with and focused on was this question of fitting in, of being normal. By the way, what's normal anyway? How do we know? Like, how do we figure it out? This was a very, very important issue for everyone. And I could say, as someone who grew up in the Hasidic, um, ultra Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn, in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, specifically the Lubavitch Hasidic community. So that's one particular branch of the
Mm,
ultra Orthodox Jewish community. Um, and I grew up there, and then I ultimately ended up leaving that way of life. And I was fascinated and perplexed and pained and troubled by this idea of what is normal and how do we know how we're supposed to act, and I could say, as a sociologist, um, we talk in sociology a lot about this idea of socialization, that there's a process people go through from a very, very young age where they
mm,
learn about the world. We talk about
mm,
agents of socialization. The first agents of socialization are usually a person's family, parents, siblings, and so on. But then as we grow up a little bit and we go to school, then the teachers, the friends at school, they become agents of socialization. And then there's broader societal institutions, social institutions like the media and popular culture and so on, that also
mm.
teach us, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to dress? How are we supposed to act? All these
Yeah.
basic things. And for people that grew up in kind of strict religious communities, whether they're ultra Orthodox Jewish communities or very strict Catholic communities or Muslim communities, if they're kind of separated intentionally, isolated from these outside sources of information, then when they decide to leave their insular religious community and kind of join the outside world, there are many, many hurdles that they have to overcome. And one of them is this issue of a kind of a lack of information, but not just, I mean, in my case and in many people's cases, there could be a lack of formal secular education where we were
Mm,
deprived of learning. In my case and many other people I interviewed, they were deprived of learning the ABCs even though they grew up in Brooklyn, and
mm,
everyone was speaking English around them. They were not taught the ABCs, they were not taught basic arithmetic and so on. So that's certainly a hurdle that they have to overcome. But then there's this more kind of nebulous body of information about how to dress, about how to act, what is considered normal in our particular society, and we simply never received that in the kind of typical way that people do over a long gradual period, and instead we're thrust into a completely alien uh, um, society and culture, and
mm.
we are struggling to try to figure out what's up, what's down, how do we make heads or tails of this. And I think one of the ways that it comes through, and it's only one, is the issue of dating and romantic
Oh,
attachments, and
mm,
sometimes people who grew up in more mainstream Jewish communities, including my wife, who grew up in very typical kind of modern sort of secular Jewish background, when she hears me complaining about my lack of knowledge about dating and how to approach women and things like that, she
mm.
says everyone's like that. This is everyone struggles with these kinds of questions. This is not unique to ex-Hasidic Jews, and I think that there is some truth to that, and there is a way that I think people who grow up in extreme or very strict religious communities, they sometimes think of all of the challenges that they face as being the result of their very religious background, so that they think, well, no one else has these kind of problems, only we have these problems because we grew up in very religious communities, and I think that that's a false narrative of in its own right, that many
Mm.
people struggle with issues around dating, around romantic attachments. They could have challenges, tension between parents and children. So there's lots of what you might consider normal things that people of all walks of life may struggle with. But I do think that people coming from kind of strict religious communities could have added or intensified versions of some of these problems, including the issue of dating, where they have no concept of how to approach people who they're potentially romantically interested in, how to express
Mm,
romantic interest in a way that is respectful and based on consent and mutuality and things like that. It could be particularly difficult for people who grew up in an environment where not only there wasn't any sex education, but there was
mm,
little or no contact between the sexes at all, where people were
yeah.
literally never talking to, girls or women, in their community. And then suddenly they're in a different context, and expected to know what to do somehow, intrinsically, when they don't actually know what to do.
I totally agree with everything you've said, and I agree. Like, I'm picking up on like the socialization and thinking that it takes a village to raise a child, in terms of just exactly as you described it. First you've got the parents, then you've got extended family, then you've got the teachers, and then it just continues to go out in waves. And I also, I love your term of like being like an alien, because I use the term, the world smacked me in the face, and it does, because you do feel like an alien, and you do feel like you don't know what is the right thing to do, how to act. And then when you spoke about dating, I found that extremely difficult, because I had never had any practice. And I have found, in actually speaking to others and watching their trajectory when they come out, like, this is mainly speaking about women, is that they tend to have had some form of abusive relationships within that sect, or group, and then they leave, but then they become very quickly romantically attached to the opposite sex, who shows them a little bit of romance, because they've never experienced that. But then they don't know how to differentiate between like a good balanced relationship compared to an abusive relationship. So it's almost like they've gone from an abusive relationship, and then they've gone kind of one step up, but it's still not the best relationship, and it can be abusive slash unequal. And I think, and I don't know whether you have noticed this, or whether you've um, heard about it from any of your other friends or anybody that you interviewed. Do you think that it takes people like us longer to assimilate, to overcome those hurdles, to assimilate into the world, and ultimately to find our romantic or partners, or our life partners?
Yes, I definitely think there's a kind of learning curve. And as you were saying, I think for people, for very strict religious communities, all for intellectual reasons, and they found intellectual inconsistencies between the various sacred texts that their community is committed to. They could leave for social reasons, or could be various kinds of abuse that is going on, and so on. But certainly, for many people, once they leave, they're trying to find, among other things, romantic, connections to people. And like you were saying, they especially if they're coming out of an abusive relationship, or or they've been abused, just in their community, they could not they may not have the tools immediately at the
Mm,
outset to be able to identify what is a truly healthy relationship and what is simply another form of abuse. So maybe
mm,
different, and in some an initial way, appealing, because it's different than the abuse that they experienced in their initial, in their original community, but still, it may be abusive in some way. It may take advantage of them, especially of their
Mm,
naivete, of their lack of knowledge about romantic relationships in the kind of quote unquote outside world, more secular modern society. And I think that for men and women, I think this is probably especially the case for women, they're uniquely vulnerable
mm,
to potentially abusive, dysfunctional people and relationships in the outside world, because they don't have the kind of uh, the typical armor that people usually develop in a kind of modern society where men, boys, and girls, and men and women are interacting with each other. Maybe there's some flirtation, and people, I have the sense, I don't really know 100% because I didn't go through this myself, but I have the sense that young women develop some kind of armor to protect themselves, sort of physically and emotionally, from
mm,
people that they don't actually want to have a relationship with. um, but if you take a young woman who grew up in a very sheltered, strict religious community where she didn't have any opportunity to develop that kind of armor or those kind of instincts, that are
mm.
necessary to survive in the mainstream secular society, she's in a uniquely vulnerable position. And I think it does take some time to develop those kinds of skills to appropriately and in a healthy way deal with romantic attachments.
Yes, I look, I and like that leads me into um, asking you in terms of like because you use the term identity formation and the being in that liminal space, and I really connected with those terms when you were saying how you're not just when you leave a community, you're not just in it and then you leave it. And I remember when I first left, I absolutely felt so much humiliation, shame, and embarrassment at having been part of that group. And I wanted to distance myself so much from it, like instantly. But then you realize, I guess I've always been an anthropologist even before I knew what anthropology was, because I used to analyze things in my brain, and I realized that in observing my own thoughts and my own behavior, that there were still things, habits and thoughts and rituals that I was still carrying over from the group. And it's only more in recent years that I've come to terms with the things that I like and for the reasons, whatever reasons they are. And, I've kept them. And but then I have found, on the other hand, that quite a few people have had a very that they haven't had a very good experience of religion, and they basically throw the baby out with the bathwater, and then live a life that's full of resentment and anger towards the church and or the group. Um, and so I think that your terms of being in that liminal space is so perfect, because it isn't something, we don't just leave a group and then suddenly we're fine. We are absolutely like still carry our experiences with us, because I mean, how can you just get rid of all those habits and perspectives that were instilled in us from a young age? It doesn't just disappear.
Right, exactly. And I think this is a really important thing, for scholars and for people who go through this kind of process to be aware of, and the truth is, this aspect of my research is really building on the scholarship from a woman named Helen Rose Fuchs Ebo, and she wrote a book called Becoming an X. And she, interestingly enough, was a Catholic nun in I think it was like the 1970s, and ended up
Right.
leaving the monastery, the cloister, and then became a scholar and wrote about this type of thing. And she focused on what scholars call role residuals. So people have different roles that they occupy in society. And she was interested in the question of what aspect of people's roles stay with them even after they transition away from that role. And she
Mm,
notes that even when people leave a role, like being a nun, and then they stop being a nun, or being part of a very religious community, and then you leave that community, there could be aspects of people's upbringing, that these residual parts, the little parts that kind of remain with people even years later, and even sometimes
mm,
against their will, which is where,
yeah.
I think it really gets interesting. Excuse me, that they might not want to do this, they may not want to feel a certain way or think about the world or themselves or God or whatever in a particular way,
Mm,
and yet they may still do these things because it is so deeply internalized, these
mm,
messages or these practices from their upbringing. And I should just step back a second and say that when I started to do my research, I, like any graduate student, I tried to read the literature and see, what was out there on this topic. And I found
mm.
a bunch of things that were written by people who studied what are commonly called cults, and by
Yeah.
scholars are often referred to as new religious movements. So, like the
Yes.
Hare Krishna, the Moonies, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the sense that I got from these scholars was that they were describing, people leaving these, very kind of insular religious communities, and they tended to describe their attachment to the community as being a binary state. Either they're a part of the community or they left it.
And yeah.
As if there's a kind of neat before and after. You know, and the more I read this and the more I thought about my own experience, and then I started to interview others, I said, well, this does not at all reflect my own experience.
Hmm.
And it doesn't reflect the experience of the other people that I'm interviewing. And I think that at least one possible explanation for this disconnect between what some of these scholars were talking about and what I was finding is that a lot of these scholars were talking about people who grew up in a kind of the secular society, and then as adults briefly joined these strict
Yes.
religious communities, and then after a
Mm,
couple months or maybe even a year or two, then they said, you know what, this is not for me, and then they left.
yeah.
And for
Mm,
those people, maybe because their experience was relatively brief, even though it may have been very intense, for those people, it may be, I don't know, I didn't research them, but it's possible that there wasn't that much of this kind of residual effects or these role residuals, these lingering aspects of their experience. But certainly for people like me, for people like you, for people who grew up in a very strict religious community and lived there for years and
mm,
potentially for decades before they ended up sort of disconnecting from those communities, for such people, I think it's really impossible that they don't have some kind of residual role residual, some a lingering um, a remnant of their upbringing. And I think, as you were saying, and I talk about this in the book, there's a couple of different ways that people could deal with their former life, so to speak. And one way is, as you were saying, to kind of completely disconnect from it, and as much as possible kind of bury it, and just put it out of sight, out of mind, kind of thing.
That's not
um
possible, I'm telling you.
but right, no, I agree. That's the thing. It's actually as far as I'm concerned, from a psychological perspective. I'm not making a
Mm,
moral judgment, but from a
yes.
psychological perspective, it's essentially a losing strategy, because
Hmm.
the bottom line is, you know, um, the experiences that people go through, especially at a young age, um, you know, uh, make a big impression on our minds and our
Oh,
hearts.
they
And
do.
the idea that we could leave the community officially, and then that would be the end of our attachment and relationship with the community. It's almost like it assumes that people are having a lobotomy, and that they're like all of their thoughts and feelings of the past have been completely discarded. But thankfully people are
Mm,
not having lobotomies, and we're the same person, the person who prayed for hours in the church or synagogue, the person who
mm,
read the sacred texts of their community for years and years, may have memorized them verbatim. That's the
mm,
same person, that's the same mind that then goes, leaves the community and tries to read Shakespeare or read Plato or whatever, read the New York Times or whatever it
mm,
is. Like, we're not two different minds, we're the same. It's the same mind, we're the same body, and therefore, in a sense, although it could be very painful to deal with these kinds of things, in a sense, I think it's a good thing that that they don't just disappear, because
yeah.
that would say that we're somehow completely disconnected from our previous experience. And I don't actually think that that's a healthy thing in general, to imagine how people operate in the world, that they you leave someplace, and then it's totally behind you, and it's almost as if you forgot that you were there. Like, that
Mm,
seems like something from a science fiction movie or something. Like, the reality is, it's the same brain that's doing the thinking, it's the same heart that's doing the feeling. So yes, there are aspects of our upbringing, and I think that the healthier way to deal with it is what I call the hybrid exit. I refer to the people who leave strict religious communities as exiters, and I talk about people who try to find some balance in their life
yes.
as the hybrid exiters, people who
Mm,
try to connect their upbringing and their former life with their new identity, so that they're not thinking
mm,
of them as completely dichotomous, disconnected things, but rather trying to find some type of connection. As you were saying, maybe people might think about the religious traditions that they grew up with, and find some particular practices or beliefs or rituals that are still
mm.
meaningful to them,
Not to them.
even though the source of the meaning may be totally different. So maybe when they did the ritual previously, they did it because they felt that God commanded them to do it, and maybe now they're an
Yes.
atheist, so they don't believe that they're commanded by
To,
God or
yeah.
required by some heavenly entity to
Yeah.
still perform this ritual. But they might find the ritual meaningful in some way. They
Oh.
may find
Mm,
that it connects them with their family or their former community or their ancestors or
mm,
whomever, or they may find it psychologically beneficial, that this is a nice ritual, not because God told me to do it, but
yeah.
because it's something that I find beautiful, I find meaningful. And actually, I'm just thinking, it reminds me, at one point, as I was making my journey out of the Hasidic community that I was
Mm.
raised in, and my parents were very determined to try to, quote unquote, get us on the straight path, which I always found so particularly disturbing, that phrase, because, you know,
That's in Catholicism too, I have to say. You have to be on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, so but it of course it assumes that there is one path, the path to God or
Hmm.
whatever. But I
Yes.
also found it there's a kind of double meaning there, that when you talk about straight, it's like taking someone who's, gay and say, no, we're going to make you straight, So
Mm,
I although that was not their literal intended,
yes.
meaning, but it always, I just found it, extra, problem with that phrase. But anyway, so my parents were trying to get us on the right path, and me and my older brother, who was also going through his own kind of religious evolution. And so at one point, my mother said, okay, we're going to take you to this rabbi. And he was a former high school teacher of mine. And he's going to, get you straight. He's going to straighten you out, you know? And I know, of course, I tried to avoid this and wiggle my way out of it. But eventually, it became clear that, like, my mother, was demanding that this had
She's
to happen.
determined.
She was determined, and because I did love my mother, and I do love my mother, and I didn't want to hurt her with this whole process. I said, okay, we'll give the rabbi a shot.
Mm,
So I went to the rabbi, and we had this whole long discussion. And make a long story short, at one point, we were talking about whether or not I believe God existed. And I said, no, I'm atheist. I don't believe God existed. And then he says, okay, well, Zalman, tell me this. Do you put on tefillin, the phylacteries, the little black boxes on your arm and on your head when you pray in the morning, which is the traditional thing for
mm,
men in that community to do? And I said, well, sometimes I do, you know. And he says, aha, well, why do you do it? And he says, if you don't believe that God exists and God is commanding you to do this, then it's just an absurd thing to do. You take these boxes that are made of cow hide, and they have, little scrolls in them with verses from the Bible, whatever, and you're taking these pieces of cow and you paint them black, and then you put them on your head, and like, this is a madman. This is insane. No rational person would ever do this unless they believe that God commanded them. Otherwise, this is just an insane thing to do. And I said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, but I find meaning in this practice. To me, it connects me to generations of Jewish men who prayed this way. It connects me to the
mm,
people in the Holocaust who, prayed this way when they were being, killed by, Nazis, and on and on. And he
mm.
says, well, that's just ridiculous. Like, how could you find meaning in something, if you don't believe in God? And I said, excuse me, Rabbi. So you're telling me now that not only are you in charge of finding meaning for yourself, but you're also in charge of finding meaning for me, that you're the one who's going to determine if I find something meaningful. You're the arbiter
Oh,
of my own meaning. How
yeah,
dare you?
yeah,
So,
exactly.
so, so I think that this is just an illustration of the fact that from a kind of very strict, some people might say fundamentalist. I don't love that term, but a
Mm,
very kind of strict religious outlook. They see things in general as kind of black or white.
right.
Either God told
Yes.
you, commanded you to do it, and therefore you have to do every single thing of it,
Thing.
or
Mm,
God doesn't exist. There's no, commandments, and therefore you don't have to do anything. And I said, well, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Those are not the
mm,
only two possible options. People could be atheist and not necessarily believe in God. And at the same time, they could find some religious rituals meaningful
yeah,
for
that's right.
them. They may not be
Yes.
meaningful, for the same reason to other people, but they could be meaningful for them and worthy
Mm,
of engagement and practice because it's meaningful to them.
I totally agree because see, for me, I don't I don't attend mass anymore, but I love going into a church, like an old Catholic church, and feeling that, like feeling that silence and feeling that grandeur and smelling the incense. And I love to listen to the Gregorian chant. And to me, it's just comforting and familiar. And it doesn't necessarily have to have meaning. It's just, as you just so aptly pointed out, it's the connection with my past. And it probably doesn't make any sense to anybody else, but that's okay because that's the thing, we're all so individual. And I was going to ask you, what kind of practices did you keep up? Any kind of practices or rituals that just have meaning for you now that you've left?
Absolutely. And I should say, you mentioned before that, like, early on, when you were leaving your community, you tried to make a kind of clean break,
Yes.
and I think that's probably very common for a lot of people, that there's a lot of anger, frustration, hurt, sometimes trauma, from
Mm.
growing up in these communities. So it makes sense to have an initial impulse to just kind of run like hell, just,
Yes.
run in the opposite direction, run
Yes.
away as far as possible, as quickly as possible. So I think that's understandable. And I think I must have had some aspect of that. But at the same time, I came to realize, like, some of these things of Jewish ritual practice were meaningful to me. As it turns out, like, wearing tefillin, putting on these boxes, is no longer something that I find meaningful, and therefore I
Mm.
stopped doing it. Um,
Mm.
you know, but I still keep them. Someone said, "Hey, could you?" Because they cost money. A scribe has to, write them by hand. The little
Mm.
scrolls inside these black leather boxes. So someone once said, "Hey, could you give me it? Give me your pair of tefillin so that I won't have to buy one." And I said, "Well, no, like not that I'm not willing to help a friend, but like it's still
Has
part
meaning.
of my has meaning. It's a part of my upbringing. No, I don't want to put them on every day, but it's still meaningful for me to have them and to occasionally see them. So that's the tefillin. But now that I'm married and I have children, and again, my wife grew up in a very Jewish but not orthodox, not very kind of strict religious
Mm.
background, and she has very positive associations with various Jewish rituals and practices. So essentially, once we were dating, and then once we got married, I kind of um, joined her in where she was at religiously. So
Right.
we have Friday night dinners every Friday night with
Mm.
our my family, as is customary. And that's special for me. It's a special time.
Mm.
The whole week is busy. We work, my kids go to school, there's a lot of
Mm.
commotion, and
Yes.
everyone's always on the move. you know
Yes.
and and then we get to have a Friday night dinner where we sit around the table, and
Mm.
we sing songs and we talk about our week. So I find that very meaningful. But it's not because, again, I believe that, God commanded me to, rest on the seventh day, rest on the Sabbath or something. No,
Mm.
this is something that I believe human beings, Jewish people, and a very long time ago developed this practice. And I think it's a beautiful practice that could be enjoyed today without any theological strings attached. So
Mm.
I think that many people might be able to find some examples like that in their own life, where they feel connected to a particular ritual, religious
Yeah.
ritual or practice, but they may change the theological or philosophical explanation or justification for the ritual, so that it's no longer based on God commanding them to do it, and instead it's
Mm.
based on them finding meaning in this practice in their own lives.
So you've taken that ritual and then you've turned it. You've just create you like you've taken the ritual, but then created your own meaning around that. And I think that's wonderful, because when you have children too, it's very I think it's very important for them to, like, as they grow older, to know your background, because I mean, inevitably, children ask questions as they grow older. I can assure you of that. And then um, you also have a guilt manipulation. I have that as well from my kids. Um, it's an ongoing thing. But thankfully for you, you have a psychologist background, so you will probably navigate it better than most of us. So, um,
Uh,
but I was going to ask you, when you started studying psychology, how did that, were there light bulb moments for you as you were studying psychology and you're thinking, whoa, like that totally makes sense? Like, how did that influence you going forward? And also, your book, Degrees of Separation. How did that? Because I'm thinking that it would have given you a good deal of insight.
Right. So I should say, so I have a bachelor's in psychology. At one point, I was going to be a clinical psychologist, and
Mm,
then I made a turn, and then I ended up in a PhD program in sociology. So I have a bachelor's in psychology and a
then
PhD in sociology,
sociology.
and and I would say that definitely both in the psychology training that I got, and especially in the sociology
Sociology.
training. I think that there was a very strong connection between what I was reading and learning about in a at school with my own evolution, religious evolution, and I don't
Right.
know that there was one light bulb moment. I think I'm too slow for that, so it's much more of a gradual process. I wish there were these kind of light bulbs just going off. I think I'm a much more kind of gradual person. It took me years to leave the community. It took me years to shave my beard, which was a big taboo in the Hasidic community. Everything
Mm,
with me is very slow. So it took me years to write my book. It works out. I get there, but it's a slow process. But I think that one thing that really there's a kind of a crossover, if you will, between my research and my own
yeah.
a religious life, had to do with the fact that when I started my PhD, my research, and I was studying people who left, the Hasidic community like I had, um,
Mm,
I had in mind this idea that I was going to focus on, why people left the community, and specifically, did they leave for kind of intellectual reasons or kind of emotional reasons? And
yes.
and at that time in my mind, these were very clearly separated, separate categories.
Hmm.
Um, and as I started to do research and as I started to interview people, I became aware of just how messy this whole thing is, and that
It's
these are
messy.
not, neat little categories,
No,
that
they are
there's
not.
the intellectual questions and there's the emotional, feelings about them. Well, guess what? People feel certain things because of emotional, commitments. People have emotional responses to intellectual problems. Like these things are very, very intertwined, and that
Mm,
eventually I realized that even the framing it this way as, did they leave for emotional reasons? Did they leave for intellectual reasons? That itself, I think, was a kind of um, a residual a way of looking at it that I got from the Hasidic community itself, because they describe, heretics, people who leave the community, and they
mm,
talk about them as, are these people who are uh, um, you know, uh, struggling with deep intellectual problems, or are these people, these bums, these lowlifes who are essentially leaving for emotional reasons, and
mm.
that they themselves use this kind of categorization, and that I realized that this was not a helpful way to think about it. And in fact,
No.
I ended up arguing in my book that even to focus on the question of why people leave is itself very problematic. And I ended up, I wrote a
Mm,
chapter called why is a bad question,
yeah.
that even though it's natural for outsiders and for people who leave religious communities to think about this question of, well, why did they leave? But the truth is that for most people the leaving process is a rather long,
It
is
is.
this protracted process, and that people could be motivated by different things at different points in the process,
Yes. Yes.
and I think it could be useful to compare the process of exiting a religion, a religious community, with the process of getting divorced, and
Mm,
if you ask someone, well, why did they get divorced, it's very possible that, let's say, it took several years for them to actually go through the divorce. They may answer
yes.
very different things at different points in the
Points at a
process,
time.
you know
Yes, exactly.
so
Yeah.
the idea that there's this kind of one correct answer, that's out there, I think is very misleading, you know.
Mm.
And instead, I think it's more helpful to realize that there tend to be emotional and intellectual aspects to
Yes.
people's exit process, and that
Mm.
part of what people do, one of the things that people do in the exit process, is create what I call an exit narrative, that they come up with a story essentially about
Yes.
their experience leaving, and that narrative tends to have some kind of um, elements that are either connected to intellectual things or emotional things. And depending
Mm.
on what environment people grew up in, depending on if they're a man or a woman, their story might
Mm.
be tinged in a particular way. So, for
Right.
instance,
Yes.
among the people that I interviewed, because the men went through this yeshiva, a religious, a very kind of intensive religious training where they were focusing on sacred texts, on the Bible, on the Talmud, things like that.
Mm.
Sometimes on spiritual, mystical texts, and that they spent years and years studying these texts. And especially with the Talmud, struggling with questions of intellectual consistency to try to make sense of these ancient books. Because of that kind of training, it's not surprising that when I spoke to many of the men in my
Mm.
sample, they tended to describe their experience of leaving the community in intellectual terms. Well, there's a
Right.
contradiction between the Bible and this passage in the Talmud, or between two passages in the Bible, or whatever. But for many of
Mm.
the women, because
Mm.
although they had some religious instruction, but the instruction, religious instruction for the women is much less. It's a kind of
Yes.
watered
Yeah.
down version of what the
Version.
men received. So because of that, when they described their religious exit, they tended to focus less on this kind of intellectual aspect of their journey, and instead talked about emotional or social factors that contributed to them leaving. And what I came to realize is it's not that the women didn't have intellectual components to their exit. It's just that they didn't
Mm.
think of those primarily because
Right.
they weren't trained in the same kind of yeshiva background that the men were trained in, the men in their community were trained in. You see? So
Yeah.
that's why I'm saying that we have to look at these kinds of narrative, these exit narratives, as themselves constructions. They're things that people
Yes.
develop. It's not that this is a court record of, well, here is the real reason why I left.
Yeah.
Instead, these are things that people develop along the way to make sense for themselves and for others that they encounter, to make sense of their experience leaving, but that these narratives themselves are shaped by their particular
Very.
background.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you find, because a question I did want to ask was, did you find that in interviewing women about their exiting decision and the process, like the whole process, did you happen to find out, or did the women happen to say that it took them longer to come to the decision to leave? And was there a difference between single women and mothers? And I asked that question because I had 8 children, age 16 down to 2, when I left. So it wasn't just a matter of me just leaving. I had 8 attachments per se, and it's not easy to try and make a decision for 9 people. You know what I mean? And so that's why when I was reading it, I'm thinking, were there single women who kind of came to the decision of leaving and then sort of left relatively quickly? And were there mothers that, had to wait a bit longer because of various circumstances?
Yeah, so absolutely. So there's a famous sociologist named Howard Becker, and he talks about this idea of commitment. What does it mean that you're committed to a particular, let's say, community or country or religion or whatever? And he
Mm.
says that commitment is based on what he calls side bets. In other
So,
words, how
mm,
how many investments did you make in this particular area, and that essentially the more side bets you made, the more ways that you're invested in that particular, let's say, community, the less
Mm,
likely it is that you're going to leave it, the more committed you are to staying there, and
mm,
and I think that that is exactly what you're talking about, that for people who are married, so they already have a much bigger investment, right? They have
mm,
a husband or wife, a partner that they're committed to, at
mm.
least potentially, and then so to leave again, they're not just a single person. They say, hey, I don't like this anymore. Okay, I'll leave,
Yeah, yeah.
and then once you talk about children, absolutely. Now there's all these other, human beings that I'm responsible for. I have to take them into account, So there's no question about it that those kinds of investments, those kinds of commitments end up making it harder for people to leave. And by the way, I think that often these kinds of communities, very strict religious communities, on some level, they understand this whole business, So I know
Mm,
in my case, there were these ideas that like if you were single, you couldn't go to college because college was considered, morally corrupting, But if
mm,
you were married, then you could go to college, Well, why is that? Logically, you're in a better position in a lot of ways to complete your college degree if you're single, when you have fewer dependents, rather than being
mm.
encumbered by, a partner and maybe children, But they were operating on a different logic. They were thinking, if you go to college and you get influenced by the secular, world, then maybe you'll leave the community. But if you're already married, the chances of you leaving the community drop.
Yeah,
If you
yeah.
have children, they drop even
Even
further
further.
because who's going to risk losing their children just to leave
Yes.
the community. So
Reggie.
I
Yeah.
think in a way, strict religious communities may be aware of these kind of dynamics, and that essentially
Mm,
they try to tie down members of their community as at an early age, so that it makes it harder for them to then step away from the community, you
Reggie.
know
Yeah.
um, and just speaking of children, I should mention that one of the things that I found. So my book is actually a comparative study between people who leave two different Hasidic
Yes.
communities.
Yeah.
One is the Lubavitch community that I was raised in, and one is
Mm,
the
that.
Satmar community,
No.
which is another Hasidic community.
Mm,
And they're headquartered. The Lubavitch community is headquartered in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, and the Satmar community has kind of two headquarters. One is in Williamsburg, also in Brooklyn, and the other one is in kind of upstate New York. Um, but there are Lubavitchers and Satmars all around the world, including in Australia. And
mm.
I spent a year in Singapore helping out the very small Jewish community there. And I actually visited Melbourne and Sydney, and I
Oh,
visited the
wow.
Lubavitch community in your backyard. So,
Oh,
or
wow. Wow.
relatively near you. So, yes, there are Lubavitchers everywhere. In smaller numbers, of course, compared to Brooklyn, but they do exist there. Anyway, so one thing that I found that was quite interesting is that the Satmar community in particular tended to use the issue of uh, child custody as a kind of
Uh,
weapon against people leaving their community. So, if you have a husband and wife, and let's say the husband, decides he wants to leave the community, then the community will back the wife in child
mm,
custody hearings and potentially raise, very large sums of money to ensure that she gets the best lawyers and other things to help her in her child custody battle in the secular courts, and
mm.
including they'll sometimes have rabbis come, or neighbors of this family come and say that the husband who is leaving the community is mentally ill, he's meshuggah, he's crazy,
Yeah.
and
Mm,
that the wife is this wonderful woman who's the most responsible person, and is a great mother, blah blah blah, and so
yeah.
they really throw their support behind the mother or the person who's staying, regardless of whether or
Yes.
not
Yeah.
it's the mother or the father. They'll put
Mm,
their support behind the parent who's staying, even if, as sometimes happens, not always, of course, but sometimes happens, that the parent who's staying is actually highly dysfunctional, and that may
yes.
be one reason, that
Mm-hmm.
the other spouse, is leaving the marriage and the community, is to get away from this very dysfunctional, partner.
Yes.
This is of no matter to the community. All
No.
the community cares about is who is the one who's staying, who is the one who's going, and we're going to, stand
So,
behind the one who's staying, even if it
yes.
involves, being less than, forthright when they,
Yes.
testify in court to try to support the parent who's staying.
Yeah.
So this is a very big issue, and people have told me, hey, I would leave the community today, but what's about my children? I don't want to lose my
Children.
children.
Sure.
So
Yes.
there's even there's a book, called Hidden Heretics, by a wonderful scholar named Ayola Fader. And
Mm.
so she focuses on people that, as she describes, who are living a double life. And by that,
Ah.
she means people who appear to be Hasidic. She focuses on the same type of communities like my research does, but she
Yeah.
focuses on people who appear to be living a Hasidic lifestyle, but sort of behind the scenes, when no one's looking, they're breaking various rules and principles of the community, and they may be atheists, let's say, or something like that. They may eat
Mm.
non-kosher food and so on, but they maintain the facade of being, a upstanding member of their community. And one of the main reasons, maybe not the only, but one of the main reasons why people do this is because of this issue of child custody, that they have children
Mm.
that were born and raised in the community, and they're
Beauty.
terrified to death of losing,
Yes.
and being cut off from those children if they leave their community.
Yeah. Well, I have a friend, like in the sectarian Catholic group that I grew up in. I have a friend who that happened to her, and it was horrific. And I think that even trying to live that double life, as you said, it's really draining, like mentally, physically, and emotionally. Because how long can you keep it up? And I know that I struggled with that when I was living in the second group, which was termed as a cult, because I felt like I didn't want to be there from the very beginning, but it was my then husband that wanted to be there. And I thought that if I sacrificed myself for a while, because I mean, I'd been brought up like that, obviously, I'm sure that there's many Jewish women that are the same, be submissive, they're subjugated, sacrifice for your husbands. And it was very much like, if I sacrifice this time for my husband, he will see the futility of it after a while, and then we'll move out and move on. But that didn't happen. And in the end, we have a saying. I don't know whether you have it in the US, but it's called it's as futile as putting an octopus in a string bag. Like,
I have not heard that expression.
and I mean, if you imagine putting
But
an octopus
octopus is not kosher, so I may be out of the loop.
right, well, an octopus in a string bag, I mean, you're going to have it all coming out everywhere. And it's just that for me, it became too hard trying to live this double life. In the end, I was just like so wrung out. Even though I had no idea what it was like to be living in the outside world, in my mind, it had to be easier than living the way I was. Um, and I mean, yes, living in the world was easier, but you have to traverse this whole rocky road up the mountain and down again. And I mean, it was 2006 when I left, and it's only in I've been going to university. I'm in my third year now, and it's only really in the last 3 years in like going to university, doing a lot of reading, interacting with different academics. There is an academic that I work with here in Australia who is very well versed in like sects, cults, new religious movements, and the effects on people when they leave. And he has helped me a lot just in like having chats and being able to rethink my experience. And then when I read your book, it's just like there were so many light bulbs that went off. And I really loved like your work is not just for those that leave like religious communities. As you said, I have 3 family members in the military, and one of them is exiting out. And, like, I have one of my other family members works for our veterans, and there is no in and out, whether it is a Hasidic community or whether it's a Catholic sect, whether it's the military, whether it's divorce. Your book, your thesis, all of this has really, it has a lot of applications across many sectors in the world. It really does, because, with the family member that's exiting defence, like, they've been in there for like 8 or 9 years now. And you can't just be a part of that and then just leave. You know what I mean? You're in there yesterday, you're out today, and hello, we're moving on. Like when you've had to, I've visited, when they have, when they've graduated from their training and going to their bedroom their room, and then, when they make their beds, it has to be all mitered corners, has to be turned over, has to be X amount of inches. You don't just go through that for that amount of years and then suddenly you just stop doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I should mention we're going to have to finish very soon, but
I realize that, yes.
I do want to mention. So there's a famous American sociologist named Irving Goffman, and he wrote a book, Asylum, and he talks about what he calls a total institution, and which is an institution where people live, work, and otherwise socialize within the institution, and POW camps, mental hospitals. These are examples of total institutions, and as well as the military. Like on a military base or whatever. But I would argue, I do argue in my book that a Hasidic community and other very strict religious communities are also forms of total institutions.
Oh, they are.
And you're very deeply enmeshed in them in all kinds of ways. It's not just a religion, you go on Sunday or something. I think sometimes when people hear about my research, they think, well, what are you talking about? I know tons of people, they used to go to church, they stopped going to church. Okay, no biggie, but we're really talking about a very different thing. We're talking about a people whose entire life was really focused on their religious community, and as you were saying, people who are in the military. I also talk about immigration. If people grow up in one country and then leave and go to another country, they have similar, there absolutely can be similar dynamics where there's aspects of their former life that get carried over into their new life. So yes, well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Like, this has been fascinating, and I would like to have you on at another time because there's so many things that we didn't cover. I mean, your research is really valuable, and I want to thank you for writing this book because, as I said, it has many applications in society. It's not just for Hasidic, leaving Hasidic communities. So thank you so much for giving me your time today. And I think that many people will find this conversation very valuable. And I look forward to chatting to you at another time.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful day. Take
Yes,
care.
you too. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.